Welcome back to Oliver Scholar's CEO Salon Series with your host, Dr. Danielle R. Moss. On today's episode, we'll be discussing anti-Asian hate and the importance of solidarity.
Hello, and welcome to the Oliver Scholar CEO Salon Series. I am so thankful for today's conversation. Like so many of the topics that we've covered as part of this series, we find ourselves in a very difficult moment in our nation's history with the onslaught of news around violence committed against our Asian brothers and sisters. And so I wanted to really take this opportunity to be in conversation with some of my Asian comrades to help us understand a little bit more the history of Black, Brown, and Asian solidarity and what we can do going forward to really build those bridges across community. So let me introduce my first guest, Joanne Yu, who is the Executive Director of the Asian American Federation. Hey, Joanne.
Hey, Danielle, how are you?
Good.
So good to see you.
And I'm also delighted to introduce Chris Kwok, who is a professor at CUNY, who's done a lot of work around this issue. So Chris, welcome.
Thank you so much.
So can I ask Joanne to start first? Can you tell us a little bit about the Asian American Federation and the work that you do?
Sure. Asian American Federation is located in New York City. We are an umbrella leadership organization of all the Asian serving nonprofit organizations, about 70 member agencies. We run the gamut, right? Like all the services, social services, housing, economic development, civic engagement. It's been a tough year for us, but this is also a really important opportunity to have critical conversations that during this time, not just about the Asian hate issues, but the prevailing racism in this country. And I am so happy that we're having this at the 1-year mark of the death of George Floyd at the hands of Derek Chauvin. And I think this is particularly a little emotional for me.
Today is definitely a heavy day. Mm-hmm. Chris, can you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your work.
Yeah, I'm a proud board member of the Federation, and I, throughout my career, have worked as a mediator, and I worked as a mediator for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the federal agency working, enforcing anti-discrimination laws in the workplace. So I had a really wonderful time sort of working for the federal government, sitting at the forefront, working for an institution that's a legacy of the civil rights movement, that as a result of the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 became part of the federal government. And I left 3 years ago, and I've been working as a mediator sort of in private sector, but continue my work in the community through the Asian American Federation, as well as the Asian American Bar Association of New York, where we put together a report about anti-Asian violence. So that's what I've done.
Great. So I wanted to kind of open the conversation with trying to get a little grounding and understanding of the lives of Asian Americans in the United States. I think everyone is kind of familiar with this archetype of the model minority. And I don't know to what extent that really reflects the lived experiences of Asians in this country, and to what extent maybe it causes the community to be invisible when issues of civil rights come up.
Sure, I think that is a real problem in our community. I think it is been a really powerful wedge dividing communities of color. So the model minority myth essentially says Asians you can succeed on your own. You don't need help because you all keep your head down. You all go to Harvard. You all do really, really well. You end up, everybody is the head of a major corporation, right? And so whenever our community, and that's not true, obviously, right? Because when our community is really diverse, there's diverse range of economic situations, there are, diverse language needs. The um, Asian American New Yorkers are the poorest in the city. They have the highest rate of English limited English proficiency, right? So the model minority myth paints this false picture of our community. And so whenever we need it, it also hurts us too. Whenever we need help and we go to the government and say we need help, they say, "Oh no, but you're doing just fine, right? Don't complain, don't do anything," right? But then they use it as a wedge against the Black and Latino communities, right? They say, "But why can't if they ask for help? Black and Latino communities ask for help. What we need more infrastructure, we need resources." They say, "Why can't you be like the Asians, right?" And so it's this falsehood that's been really effective tool in dividing our communities, and refusing to see the humanity in all of us.
Chris, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, the use of Asians within the rise of capitalism as the wedge is actually long-standing. Goes back hundreds of years. The model minority is the most recent sort of use of wedge politics with Asians as the wedge. Beginning in 1966 and its modern interpretation in America and that we live with today. But if you go back to sort of world colonialism in the island of Jamaica, not Jamaica Queens, the island of Jamaica, a extraction colony where they brought enslaved people, forced them to work. And when they saw Haiti go into revolution and throw off their colonial masters, the English, because it was an English colony, they were nervous. So there is an actual memo to Home Office to say, we really need a population to come in. We need to bring in another population to shield us and to not be a wedge, but like be between the enslaved and us, so that there is going to be some other conflict or some other relationship that can make it more complicated. And we think the Chinese are ideal for this. Wow. We're going to bring them in as shopkeepers, and they're just going to make things a little more stable and prevent the overthrow. I mean, that's an actual memo. And then it actually happened. So I think what we have to remember is that a lot of these things that we take for granted and that we think of as normal, is really created by sort of capitalism. And we have to remember that the development of world capitalism that we still live under was developed on colonialism and also slavery. And, so those things are just really have long, deep histories in the last 500 years.
So I was probably today years old almost when I heard about the murder of Vincent Chin in California and the role that Jesse Jackson and other Black leaders played in bringing visibility to that situation. Why are these instances of solidarity between Black, Brown, and Asian communities almost covered up? Like, we don't talk about them, we don't lift them up. How does that happen? Like, how can we show up differently for each other?
When we think about Vincent Chin was actually killed in Detroit. Jesse Jackson held a rally in San Francisco during his primary with the Asian Americans, activists who then worked on his campaign, and he made it a national issue. And part of it is that ideas, alliances, and stories that don't fit the national narrative that is approved to be the national narrative are forgotten or just placed on a shelf in a dusty college library or placed somewhere else. And it's not exactly like we would say of like another country, oh, you guys repressed that, you eliminated it, right? We eliminate things by forgetting. And by just putting it there and go look for it if you want. No one's hiding it from you. Well, then it just tends to disappear. And in the 50s, a lot of the racist laws that had characterized sort of American society disappeared. The Naturalization Act of 1790 reserved naturalization for free white men. So if you're a free black person, if you're enslaved, you're an indentured white person, you couldn't naturalize to become an American citizen. Federal law. That was gotten rid of in 1952. What was happening? Well, after World War II, America, having fought, Nazi Germany and the Alliance, was preparing to be the world leader. It already was the world leader, but it looked at all the things it had on its books and was like, can't have these things on our books. We want to be leader of the free world. And we just spent all the time sort of all this propaganda against Nazi Germany, and a lot of the stuff we're saying, is very similar. So we got to get rid of it. And so that's the process of forgetting. And it's very much a part of our national history.
And I would add about Vincent Chin too. Besides Vincent Chin, and that was such a powerful moment for us. And I remember being in high school and realizing how, that was a really scary time for us, right? For the Asian Americans, because I was thinking, oh my God, what's really scary is they're punishing people who look like me, right? And it was so violent, and there were these protests all around the country. But besides that, what we need to think about is even in New York City, when there was a Chinese American man who went to get help from the police, somebody was being beaten. And I think he had pointed it out to the police, and he was beaten by the police. And so the community wanted to rally, right? And it was really encouraged and supported by the Black and Latino leaders. And so, they were able to rally enough, support each other in these, this moment of like police brutality in our city, where I think I was reading something and they had like 120,000 people in the streets because they were so outraged. And so like a lot of the Black leaders I know and work with in the city have a long history supporting Asian American community issues, because we were, the communities learning, communities figuring out how to organize within this context of this, of the system in this country. And so what do? Who helps us? Our Black and Latino brothers and sisters saying, this is how you need to do it. This is how you need to organize. This is who you meet with, right? So a lot of the social justice work that is happening is actually a collaboration of the Black, Latino, Asian communities.
It was so interesting how untruths can rise up in a moment like this. So I've heard Black and brown folks say, well, it's not clear to me that Asians were in the streets with us for Black Lives Matter. I was like, are you paying attention to the faces in those crowds? Mm-hmm. Right? They were diverse. And I think it was the diversity of those crowds and the fact that you saw Black Lives Matter protests in communities that didn't even have Black people, right? That led to the kind of public policy response, kind of, sort of, right? We're not there just yet. And also the corporate response. I don't think that we could count on that level of attention and focus on the issues without the solidarity that we've experienced from diverse communities. And Joanne, I feel like we first met when I was president of Black Agency Executives, and we were part of a cohort of Black, brown, and Asian nonprofit leaders who were trying to get more resources into our communities.
Absolutely. I was thinking about that too. It was the Communities of Color Nonprofit Stabilization Fund. It was to make the city invest in our communities, our nonprofits that are essentially serving as little mini governments, right, in our communities. And they have no resources. There's no infrastructure. And when we were working together, there wasn't even a model. And so we would all reach out to our friends from across the country to be like, hey, have you guys ever seen this? If you have, can you show us what it means? And they were like, oh, there isn't a model, that you're building the model. But once you guys figure this out, why don't you come back to us and share it with us, right? And so I get a lot of questions about that. But I think now we're in our, I don't know, I feel like it's been forever ago, but it's like in its fifth, sixth year. And I remember all the years when we didn't get the money, right? And it really was about the three communities going in together to say, we are an industry that supports our communities. We need this funding, right? And so, yeah, I think, it's a really proud moment that I share with you and with our other colleagues. But, that's not celebrated often because it's a city thing, right? And we're busy saving our communities, but it really is something that we should be very proud of because it's a unique model that doesn't exist anywhere else.
And that commitment that we all had to investing in Black, Brown, and Asian-led organizations, and the leadership and this notion that my friend Ana Oliveira talks about, right? Solutions and problems reside in the same communities, and I think it really leaned into that. I think it was during that period, Joanne, that you shared some really startling statistics about the underinvestment by philanthropy in Asian communities. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. When we did the report, the Federation, is a census information center, and the job that we're most proud of is just pumping out statistics for our community, because I think at the end of the day, we share stories, we share personal stories, we share professional stories, but whenever we're in front of stakeholders, right, and we share these stories, they say, okay, but those are your stories, right? Nothing beats numbers, nothing beats data, right? So we walk in and say, we did the study in the 13-year period, right? Let's look at the number of dollars a city invested in the Asian American community. We are, I think back then we were about 12% of the population. Now we are 16% of the population. Back then it was 12%. We were getting 1.5% of the city contract dollars to serve our communities from the city. For the private philanthropy, the private foundations, the number is less than 1%, right? So we're this fastest growing. We have all of the complexities of, we don't have a shared language. We have varying immigration histories. There's a lot of, there's refugees, and there are, immigrants who've been, there are Americans who've been here for 4 generations that are always seen as the other, right? And yet we don't have the resource to support our communities the way they need to. And so being the poorest New Yorkers, it means that we are under-resourced to languish in generational poverty unless there's a real solution to get our communities out of that. And so, yeah, I'll stop there. And yeah.
Great. Chris, can you talk a little bit about your work, I guess, at EEOC? Have you seen a shifting trend in terms of how diverse people are experiencing work, or are we having the same kinds of issues and complaints in 2021 that you would have seen in 1975?
Sorry, guys.
That's okay. We love babies. Oh, it's a human moment.
I have a little baby pass off.
The Trump presidency really radicalized different parts of the population in really interesting ways, starting with the Me Too, which was really sort of like a backlash to sort of the sexism of the election of President Trump, right? He got elected in spite of that video, which would have killed any other candidate, and the sexism and I'm not going to take this BS anymore, really kind of shoved us into a new era dealing with sexual harassment claims. From 2000 to 2010, we dealt with sexual harassment claims and settled sexual harassment claims in a very specific way. We moved people on, the women on, usually. They got a sum of money, and then we accepted it. Well, the male is a big star. He's a big earner, and what are you going to do? Just go find another job, And then it's like the scale fell off our eyes after a social movement changed the world. We're like, what are we doing? That's ridiculous, right? No, that's not okay. And it kind of went again with BLM. Once again, the major justice movement of American history for the last 150 years, going all the way back to the Civil War, and sort of the foundation of the modern America that we still live in, and many of the issues that we still wrestle with, right? The mistreatment of people as property, right? That's why we have to say Black Lives Matter, because ingrained in our law is that Black lives didn't matter. because they were property. And that's why, if anyone ever wants to know why that term is okay, or in terms of talking about it, those are things that we need to constantly remind this country about, right? And I see Stop Asian Hate, whether we like the term or not, and there's some who don't like, within the movement, it's fully within that spectrum, that sort of social justice movement of freedom from sort of all the different sort of things that oppressed people wrongly. And so you see that echoed in the, claims that come forth. It doesn't happen immediately. I always found that the African Americans came to the EOC and it was like coming home. They knew exactly what they were doing because they were part of that fight. They bought it, they marched for it, they fought in the streets, and then they made it part of the law and then created the institutions. And other people that came along with that sort of wave of freedom, whether it be sort of like, age discrimination, disability discrimination, all those things came after. Without the original sort of civil rights movement of the 60s, although some call it the second civil rights movement, we wouldn't have any of those. So, Asians, because Asians, and Joanne kind of mentioned it, Asians are both the oldest, some of the oldest immigrants, but then the majority of Asians came after 65. There was a lot before 65, but as compared to the rest of America, they were small. Chinese, Japanese, and Filipinos for the most part. They created the term Asian American in 68, 69 out of the Black Power movements, and the anti-war movement in Vietnam. So the new immigrants don't necessarily know that history or are connected to it naturally. And so it's a difficult, not a difficult conversation. It's just something that the Asian American community, imagined community as communities are, need to really gel around and come together and to educate and teach each other. And I think because of the social ferment of the time that we're in right now, that is happening. And so, while we are learning about ourselves, we have to teach others in our community and also teach people in the mainstream community and work with Black and Latino communities. It's always been there. It's often been forgotten, obscured, not part of the narrative that is taught and remembered, but it didn't mean it didn't exist. And it did mean it was very vibrant. It just was kind of, history happened, demographics happened,
Right.
And Daniel, I love the comment about the BLM, right? Like, where are the Asians in BLM? And I tell everybody, I remember I've been marching before there was a BLM, right? Like, come on now, right? Like, we're the OGs, right? But I, very much what, Chris said is that, the Asian American community, we certainly recognize the civil rights that we have because of the Black community's commitment and their sacrifices. And that's something that, we need to be Black to acknowledge, right? And so we are beneficiaries of that. And of course we acknowledge that. And so for us, the commitment of racial justice is always at the forefront of all of our work because, do you really want to live in a world where, you get something that nobody else has? That doesn't work like that. And that's not good. And what I don't like about how things always play out is that as we talked about during Communities of Color Nonprofit Stabilization Fund, right? We would get like $1 amongst us to split, whereas other communities are getting like gazillions of dollars, right? It's still playing out, right? And I'm still calling my Black and Latino colleagues, be like, why aren't you on this call? What call? You need to join this call so we can yell together, right? That solidarity is a lived commitment that we have. And just because you don't see it all the time front and center, I think people don't realize that, right? But it's been there. It's a commitment that we have. And if you work for social justice for the Asian community, then you have to work for social justice for the Black community.
Right. And I think vice versa, right? And I think that's been the history of Black folks in this country, like from the beginning. Like, anything that benefits the least of us necessarily benefits all of us, right? Because it encompasses all of that. Chris, you hit on something that made me think about a time when I was leading another organization and we decided to show Eyes on the Prize as a series over lunch. And we had a somewhat, diverse and international staff. And I was blown away and hadn't really thought about this when some of my staff who were not born and educated here came to me and said, I had no idea. Like I came here as an adult. I didn't have this history. I mean, even Black folks who were emigrating from the Caribbean and Africa really don't understand the history and the struggle and the level of exhaustion that Black Americans experience because we have been out, at this for so long. How can communities begin to close those gaps? Because I've had friends say, when I was coming through immigration, the folks said to me in a very direct way, like, don't deal with Black Americans. They're nothing but trouble. Like in the immigration office.
Yeah.
And so that's their entree into the U.S. kind of like social political structure.
Yeah. I mean, for those of you so starting outside the country and going through, sort of the international sort of view of America post World War II was a very triumphant sort of view of America. Like, we fought for freedom, we won freedom for the entire world, and we're the most just, most everything in the world. And we got some Black people that are complaining back home. They're the troublemakers, but we're opening the doors for you. And so, a lot of the immigrants, one of the questions you might, that I say is, who are they grateful to? So they think, oh, well, America is a white country. They made this country. They're letting me in. So, secretly, or maybe not so secretly, that's who I'm grateful to, and that's who I want to be like. There are some Black people that are troublemakers. We just steer clear of them, right? And that is a very sort of broad brush sort of stroke. And I'm not saying everybody, right? But that is probably going to represent a lot of the views, because that was the American international propaganda post World War II. And as they come into this country, and even if you grow up in this country, you may not learn eyes on the prize and understand the history of this country, at least going back to Reconstruction and what happened of a promise delayed for 100 years. You know what I mean? We weren't taught that. We weren't taught that Reconstruction was a path where America could have gone down the right road. It could have. But I went to junior high school, here, and high school here. And it was taught as, we had Reconstruction, then it was over. And then we moved to something else.
Yeah.
Really interesting. It's never taught like, we could have done the right thing. We did it for a little bit, and then we decided not to, but it wouldn't be. So how do we tell this history of this country? I think Obama articulated it in the best way, which was, this is a project that we're constantly rewriting, and we want this country to live up to its best ideals, not to its worst. And now I'm like, okay, I get it, right? Because it's like, this country had these ideals. It knew what it could do. It did the right things sometimes, often at great struggle and the push of its most marginalized. From the margins, they brought freedom to push people towards this country's best ideals. So being in the margin is not necessarily such a bad thing. They suffered, they had nothing. And then from nothing, they created this country. In 1965, many people think of the Voting Rights Act, as the end of the modern civil rights movement, because that's like the second founding. That's when America truly achieves its ideals, to say, okay, under law, we can't exclude you. Under law, we're going to have you vote. And right around that time, the immigration laws are rewritten because of the civil rights push to be non-racist. Because up to that point, they're like, only people from certain European countries are welcome. Everyone else, no. So everyone comes in, but they don't know who opened the door. They're not exactly sure who opened the door. So you know what? There might be some tension, because if Black folks feel like the immigrants that came after us and benefited from that struggle, they would have some reason to feel some resentment. Let's be real about that. Mm-hmm. And then they come into delis and they come into interactions and they're negative. Okay, so there is real conflict that I don't think of it as super deep rooted. I think there's real conflict, but we need to be like, when we talk about the LA riots or rebellion, if we only talk about Blacks versus Koreans, then we have distracted that it was Rodney King and the acquittal of the 4 officers. That was the real issue.
Right.
That's the real issue. Because every time we talk about it, we talk about, Koreatown and Black. It's not because we shouldn't, but it is not the end all be all of that issue. And it obscures, it distracts. And I go back to that sort of like document in the island of Jamaica. It's the distraction that's the real danger. It's a distraction of us from saying, this is a real thing, but what is the really, really big major thing? you know, and that is the danger of us being distracted by these things, the Black versus Asian narrative. It is not that it is completely untrue. It is that it is an important topic that we need to discuss, but then there are other topics that are probably as or more important that we need to focus on: systemic racism and white supremacy.
Right. And you kind of referenced that assault on Koreatown following the verdict. And for those who may be a little less familiar, I think the assumption was that it went back to the murder of Latasha Harlins by a Korean grocer who thought that she was taking a bottle of juice or something.
Right.
And it's almost like I remember being a kid during that period and not having experienced, obviously, that level of violence, but definitely a distance and sometimes a little contempt, in between the two groups. And so how do you move forward from that?
You talk about it. We talk about how that that there were no businesses that served people in African American neighborhoods because white sort of banks, deliberately left cities underserved by transportation networks, by stores. They did not sort of bankroll Black business people. The new immigrants that came in bankrolled themselves. They bankrolled each other. And so, because that one bank's like saying, oh, you want to open up a deli there? Go ahead. They were just like, where can we afford it? And where can I do this $50,000? And they're just like, okay. And they just happened because they were underserved. And then when decades of interactions, and not all of them were negative. There are many great stories, right, that we don't think of, but there are bad ones that are real. And they became the focal point. Like, oh, that's just that. But they were just there. But they were placed by sort of the system that, the white people had decamped. You couldn't take the bus to the suburbs. And once you got off the bus in the suburb, there was no street for you to walk on. You know what I mean? Like the post-65 creation of the American suburb was real racial flight and racial separation. That's why, it was this alarm system. Is, let's see a Black person in the suburbs, I'm going to stop you because you don't belong here. You know what I mean? That was
right.
And so we can talk about how these racial systems set up people to be in conflict just out of there, right? And if we understand it, we can say, you know what, that's a pretty shallow sort of like history of conflict. Like, let's not say there's no conflict. Let's say where it come from. Oh, 50, 60 years? Okay, what about 400? That's kind of what I'm saying. It's like we don't protest Wall Street banks that financed the buying and selling of African slaves in the South. We tend to have these regional memories where we're like, the Northeast was pretty non-racist. Well, the big banks all profited off of human trade of Africans, and but they were not sought after, in outrage, because it's almost like they're so removed. It's like they're not a thing. So, but then the Koreans or the Asians that own the delis are there. They're vital things. There was an interaction that someone didn't like, and then they are the targets. And then the wedge, and then the middle people serve as a buffer, and that's the real danger. So I think if we talk about it, we're honest, we make apologies for the things that didn't go right. You know what I mean? But then learn about the largest system in which people were placed that didn't have power and access to capital, right? Like, I think that's how we go forward.
Mm-hmm. And I think sadly that narrative still plays out, right? For the Korean community after the riots, I will say the Korean community developed its own distrust of law enforcement, right? To say there was an opportunity where you could have come in, but literally the order from the top was, let them duke it out, right? Let them, because if this was happening in Beverly Hills, they would have stopped that in a heartbeat, right? They were just basically like, we're not going in, let them deal with it themselves. And so there was a purposeful, that's why the Korean community sees it. You didn't even come when, basically we're having shootouts like in the Wild West in the streets. Where were you? Where were you? Right? You didn't come to help anybody. And so, of course, the Korean community was resentful. But to even go back to your, the conversation about like how we don't even know our history, right? Like the adults don't know the history. Our kids aren't taught our own history in the schools, right? I can't tell you how many places where I go and I say, let me tell you about Vincent Chin. And kids are like, who's that, right? So our kids don't even know who our own heroes are, right? Because we've never seen that taught, we've never seen that reflected. Black kids don't know who their heroes are because it's always in like these weird little bite-sized, almost like fetishizing framing, right?
Mhm.
But nobody ever talks about here are all of these stories, the Latino community and the indigenous community, but then nobody ever talks about how have these communities cooperated together, right? How do they see each other, and how have they worked together? What are those histories, right? So I often sit and think about like, wow, it really is true that the history is written by the winner, right? Like the
Mhm.
winner, right? And for all the communities of color, we are not the winners because we are not we've been victimized, right? And we are trapped in this system of white supremacy, right? And it that system of racism serves it well if we are all under its thumb and not cooperating and not having conversations like this to say, wait, this is wrong, and what is happening to the Black community, the Latino community, LGBTQ, Indigenous, the Asian American community. We are going to say no, and we're going to start to say, no, I think we're going to start to get together and work together and demand that you see our contributions and you see the humanity in all of us.
Mhm. And, I would love, as you're talking, to think about how do we create opportunities or entities that will allow us to continue to create space for us formally and not episodically. Because I think the opportunities for education, really, really need to be ongoing. Both of my grandfathers owned small businesses in New York City. And it was very hard to get capital. And we know that there was an assault on Black-owned banks,
Right.
right? So,
Right.
so when
Both
people,
physically and also metaphysically,
like, if
right?
we
Mhm.
if we can't destroy you through our policies, we will literally burn your stuff down to the
Mhm.
ground. And I think people lose sight of the level of violence that racism in all its forms has unleashed on all of our communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think back to Reconstruction and the enormous progress that was made by African Americans in that span of 10, 12 years that Reconstruction really lasted. And these were people that were enslaved, held in chains, denied education, and the enormous education, economic, and political advances they made in a decade. I read the history and I feel actually sorrow because I'm like, you know what? If we had just let things be and given them some half, even like a quarter of a fair shot as a country, I think we'd be so good.
Yeah.
We'd be so good. We'd be through that. We might be through half of that already. It just was such a lost opportunity for our country. And I remember reading that recently because I spent a lot of time going back into it at the beginning of Trump's election because I felt historically we were in a very similar moment. And I was like, oh, we're in another Reconstruction. So, and some writers have been, writing about that. The first Reconstruction was after the World War, after the Civil War. And some legal rights were given, a little economic and political process was made, but then that was all thrown away. Asian Americans benefited from some of the progress that was made because the 14th Amendment gave birthright citizenship to African American slaves. Chinese litigated that issue, Wong Kim Ark, and got a little toehold in America because of birthright citizenship being given to Chinese, Japanese, and the Filipinos that came later. What they did was they tried to restrict Asian women from coming, so that you would not have children have birthright citizenship. That was the first Reconstruction. Right. The second Reconstruction was the Civil Rights era, 54 to 65. Out of that, Asian Americans were very small. They were like 0.5% in America at that point, but they benefited. They took inspiration. They created the Asian American title to work together. It's an organizing thing. And now some say, and we can all maybe work together. We're in the third moment of Reconstruction through Me Too, through BLM, through Stop Asian Hate, where we can get together and make this country live up to its best ideals. And now we're here in power. And you see the push against that, the restriction of the voting rights, those kind of things. Trump wanted to get rid of birthright citizenship. So you're like, as someone who loves history and is watching this, you're like,
Mhm.
I'm just living that 19th century again. And it just shows you how we haven't come too far to not come so far. Because I used to think of history as like a progression. That's so long ago. I don't think about that anymore after Trump's election. I think of it now as a pendulum that we have to push forward, because there will and could be backlashes, and we have to push forward. And we push forward together by creating majorities, right? Creating majorities that work together. White people too. This is not just like a Black, Asian, Latino against white people, because we have to have this majority of people that believe in a multiracial democracy so that we can have a country that will function. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Chris, you mentioned that some people are not crazy about the Stop Asian Hate moniker and hashtag. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Someone said that refers to Asian people hating. So it's like, hey, like grammatically, like they want something like, the different things. And, some people also say that it sort of takes us away from the systemic nature of what this is, that it's not like, oh, if you stop individuals Asian hating, like we're going to be good. Right. Like it's more than that. So, like, I'm like, okay, I get it. I get the criticism, but it's the idea, I just get on with it, it's, so it's really just sort of picking at sort of the meanings of, once you break it down grammatically, or maybe what that means without a systemic critique in the hashtag. Yeah.
So, Joanne, you alluded to the idea that that the Asian community is broad in terms of ethnicities, languages. You have South Asian Americans, and yet everyone is kind of like grouped together around an identity that I'm not sure people necessarily connect with. How do you bring all of those communities and identities together as in your work?
Sure, that's such a great question, because that is, right? It's even in the South Asian community, there's India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, right? And the East Asian is the Koreans and the Chinese, right? And honestly, some of these countries have conflicts with each other. When you get here, you have the pleasure of being an Asian American, where you start from the bottom unless you come with a ton of money, right? But our community has been here for many generations, as Chris said. One of the things that I joke about with some of my girlfriends who've been here for many, many generations, right? It's the assumption that we're always like fresh off the boat, right? Like they're the, I have friends who,
it's like, where are you from? It's like Queens.
Precisely. That is the question that we always talk about. And it's like that cringe question, right? So when I get together, we say, how many times were you asked, where are you from? Where are you really from? And when you say, I'm from here, they say, oh, no, but really, right? Why is it so hard to believe that we're from here? We are Americans, right? And so I think that is an assumption that we get a lot, right? It's the microaggression, where are you from? Because your English is really good. Chris, I love the comment about, why people might not like Stop Asian Hate, because I will say, as an immigrant, and English is my second language, whenever I look at anything, right, documents, anything, I am like a lunatic about punctuation and grammar, because I'm thinking like, I don't want anybody to be like, oh, she missed that because she's an immigrant, this is her second language, right? So it makes me hyper vigilant. But I have friends who've been here many generations, and when they say, where are you from? They say, from here. No, where are you really from? Your parents and grandparents. How about if you've been here for 4 generations, you say, we're really from here? Why is there always an assumption that we are not from here, right? And so we have people who've been here for a long time. We have newcomers coming in every day.
Just like white folks, actually.
Precisely.
They didn't all get here on the Mayflower.
Exactly. And, there's all the diversity in languages, right? I have a staff member who is from India. She speaks like 6 or 7 languages because that's what she's used to. So, there's a lot of different languages. Sometimes it's hard because we don't have a shared experience from our home countries. We don't have a shared language, right? We don't have shared immigration points, right? People come at different times. My family came here in 1972, shortly after, naturalization from Asia started cranking back up again. But I think So it is, but what we tell people is no one Asian community is strong enough or big enough to stand by itself, right? Like the Chinese community is the second largest immigrant community in New York, but you're not as big as, you know, the Dominican community, for instance, right? So how do we become stronger? How do we fight for resources together under this thing called Pan Asian? That is by being Asian American and working together and being able to say, no, uh, we these are the shared values we have. We need resources. We need to all succeed here together. So we want to be given the resources that we are asking for. So it's a difficult thing, but it is. I'm going to tell you that is a hill I'm going to die on. Right? It
Yeah.
is a shared experience of immigrants and from communities of color, of women, Asian Americans. There's so many, you know, ideas that we need to start to think about. And as the kids call it, intersectionality, as the kids call it, right? But that is really the real work that we're all doing together, is to recognize and support each other's good social justice work.
Can I just ask the folks who are joining the live, if you have questions, please put them in the chat so we can use our last few minutes to get your questions answered. So, it also occurs to me as we're having this conversation, when I think about the life of Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and even Fred Hampton, it was at the point when they actually tried to bring all of these communities together, including poor whites, that they were assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like, you want to ride the bus, you want to sit at the lunch counter. Okay, I got that. But if you want to be in real solidarity with poor white folks and a diverse group of people of color, that we can't have.
Yeah, that was the original one of the original rationales for enslaving Africans, was that indentured white people were coming to these colonies like 7 years, 10 years, but then they were escaping, and so then they were like, well, enslaved Africans can solve this problem where we have to go after white people and then they can disappear. And so there was a deal kind of struck within sort of American society where, poor white folks, if we bring black people in, we're going to create a hierarchy and you're never going to, have to worry. It was a very dark deal upon which America's racial sort of hierarchy was built. Trump's grandfather came in the middle of the 19th century, same time that a whole bunch of Chinese came. 3 generations in, no one's ever sort of questioned, Ivanka,
where are you from?
That's right, Germany, right? And so, it's really that whiteness equals American is at the heart of the definition, and who can become someone from Russia, the Soviet Union, who came in the 80s after the fall. Their children now are seen as white people and able to assume sort of whiteness. African Americans who have been here 500 years are Americans, but still kind of like they're not the prototypical. It's a very deep, sort of part of American racial hierarchies that we need to be aware of, and that we need to really, I think, actively sort of step away from. Because we can just support that hierarchy just sort of sometimes without even realizing it in our heads, by using American as shorthand for a white person. You know what I mean? Like, which often happens.
Yeah.
I was talking to a young white woman who works in the social sector during the last year. She was like, I feel like I should be doing something. What can I do? And I was like, talk to white folks. Like, because I understand that there are people of every background in this country who are hurting. And to me, they are falling for the biggest hope, I've ever seen, right? This idea that you will lay on the sword for some ideals that actually don't serve you, that don't work in your favor. I don't understand the psychology of it, but I guess, Chris Rock once said, there's a poor white busboy in this room who understands the racial hierarchy and wouldn't trade places with me despite the fact that I'm rich.
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. And it's so interesting too, because during the height of all of the attacks, you know who was reaching out to me, right? It's all of my Black friends and colleagues. Are you okay? What do you need me to do? How can I stand with you, right? Certainly at the height of BLM and just watching just the tragedies that happen in the Black community, I'm texting my friends like, what do you need me to help you with? Do you need me to come to a rally? How can I stand with you, right? I mean, like, I feel like, my God, like the victims, like we're talking amongst ourselves, like,
Right.
right? And like the conversations that need to happen. And yes, I have friends who are not, white friends who said, are you okay? But like, you need to go talk to your community because you're holding all the cards, right? I know who my community is because we're talking to each other and we're standing together. But it's like, yeah, exactly what you said. Like, go have that conversation. And when we talked about Dr. King and role models, I was asking my mom. I said, my one of my role models is Dr. King, and obviously, John Lewis, right? And my mom said, oh, you know who my idol is? Nelson Mandela. And I was like, here are these two Korean women, right? Are like are the people that we respect the most as doing the most for humanity are Black leaders who live their lives the way that we need to live now, right? But you're right, is that they're killed when they're starting to make sense and they're galvanizing people and we're coming together as a community, right? But I think the thing I think about COVID, and I think it's so horrible in so many ways, but if there was a blessing during COVID, is it cracked open the injustices and inequalities in our community, right? Look at who was dying. Look at who was losing jobs. It's people who look like us, right? Because people had money, they all left the city and went to the Hamptons, right? But we had to stay here to go to work. They had to, ride the subways. They were getting beat up because they're Asian. Black people were dying at the highest rates. And I thought, at that point, I was, doing 50,000, testimonies to government. And basically, like, what is our shared value as we come out of this, right? We're all going to say, oh my God, look at this racial inequality, right? But as we come out of this, what is that justice look like? What does equality and equity look like? And how are we going to work through this? And how are we going to really, how are we really going to fight to build a new world? Because I think this is that once in a lifetime opportunity. And people all nodded. But then as we all are getting vaccinated and life is starting to figure out what normal is, nobody's talking about that. And to be honest, I want to talk about that because we can't continue to live this way. We can't live to distrust each other. We can't harm each other. We can't, sit by, when racism is happening, and to say that we're okay with that, because I think we are not okay with that.
Right. What do the panelists think about the hate speech directed at Asians due to Trump portraying COVID as a Chinese Asian virus? How can we change the tide and support one another to correct this?
Yeah, no, Joanne and I wrote a op-ed in Daily News in March of 2020 about the weaponizing coronavirus and how that put a target on Asian Americans' back. It was a little bit in the future because we went straight into shutdown, so that kind of dampened things for a while. But then as we came out, what we knew would happen, unfortunately did happen. Yeah. Part of it is calling it out in the circles that you're in, if Asian people are not there, to say, hey, this is why it's not cool. This is why that fusing Asian people with a virus and then they're going to become the scapegoat leads to danger for Asian Americans, and particularly Asian American women, who are 60% of all the people receiving harassment and violence. So I guess it's really to be an ally and to understand. And I think, to Dr. Moss's earlier question, I think education is really at the center of everything. That's why I teach Asian American studies. Because and I'm so lucky to have a really diverse group. So it's just not Asian kids. It's great. And when you teach in New York City at Hunter, you've got all these different people coming in, and I didn't expect that, but I was like, cool, welcome to the conversation. Let's learn. And, and I think we need to do that, maybe offer like a module that we can offer on Zoom, across the country for people to come in and learn about a different about history that we're taught in our traditional curriculums, which are still extremely traditional and really quite conservative in a really kind of that I think will take a long time to change. So I think we need to do things around the edges before while we work to get the main story and narrative changed.
Yeah, and there's the part of the question is about how do we change the tide and support one another to correct this by having conversation like this, right? Being honest, being open, and to be able to look at situations where you think you can be an upstander that you can help to influence. To say, sometimes people in panic will leave out steps, right? So I'm thinking like, wait, so one day I'm your neighbor and you see me every single day and you wave to me, right? And then when Trump says it's China virus, all of a sudden you think I have it. Like I've been your neighbor I live next door to you.
Right.
What has changed overnight, right? And for we need to have conversations within our own communities and we have to check our own biases and racisms too, right? But I will say, as I've worked with the Asian community, I will say, George Floyd's death shook the Asian community in a very, very real way. And the Asian community was outraged. How did they kill somebody? How did the police kill somebody, right? And then nothing's gonna happen, right? I mean, like Asian Americans were furious. But even before that, when we're hearing stories of, by the way, the Black community is dying from COVID because they don't have masks, right? Korean small businesses was like, how can this even be? Like, are they are they intentionally killing us? We've had small businesses say, I have masks. I'm in Korea. I'm going to ship you 100,000. You distribute it to the Black community. I'm going to drive to Albany and go get some in my warehouse. I'm going to come down here and I want to share it. And you have to make sure it goes to the communities that don't have these masks, right? And so at some point, like I was like, I'm going to this community to deliver masks. I think people are starting to make that connection. And in the pandemic, the one thing is like we learned that we are in it together and that we had to support each other and see the best of humanity and the best of ourselves in each other, right? Because what's good if you survive the pandemic, if everybody is
Right.
armed around you? That is not the world that we want to live in, Yeah.
So, first of all, I just want to say if you guys develop a module to teach and explore Asian American studies, I'm there. Count Oliver Scholars as a partner in that work. I think it's so important. We only have a couple of minutes left. Do you have any parting words that you want to share with folks who tuned in?
It is wonderful to be with you and to talk about these things, because the more I talk about these things, the more things that light bulbs that sets off in my head that I dive back into, learn more. And the more I learn, the more I know that a lot of the history that we learn in our, schooling is not true or incomplete.
Yes.
And I think that, so I think that, being in the mode of the formal education that you receive is but to prepare you that once you're done with that formal education, to keep on learning for yourself and for your community forever, right? That's really the beginning of your education. If you stop reading when you're done with your college or graduate school, that's not the right answer. The right answer is to always be learning, because things are always being learned or written and I see myself humbly as part of that. And that's, I think, the key to, having a vibrant community is to keep on learning and then keep on reaching out.
Yeah. And for me, I would say we need to recognize that each of our communities have our own trauma, right? That we have to deal with and we have to work out. We need to work within our own communities, but then we need to start to reach out and to look for opportunities where we can collaborate, where we have shared pain, to be able to support each other. Maybe it's not your issue today, but it might be your issue tomorrow, right? I know it's my issue today. How do we support each other so that way, ultimately, this anti-Asian hate, this is all centers around racism, right? And how we see each other, discrimination. And so I know that, to understand that we all really are, I mean, as corny as it sounds, we really are in this together, and we need to really support each other to listen to each other, to create opportunities. We have conversation like this. And Danielle, as a longtime friend, I'm going to say I'm waiting for my Dr. Danielle calendar, Dr. Danielle-ism calendar to come out.
Oh, you're too kind. You're too kind. Do you have any books that you want to recommend? Because, you know, we are an educational organization, so that would be my last request.
The Making of Asian America by Erica Lee. A really nice introduction to Asian American sort of history.
Love it.
Yeah.
I have to add that to our summer institute. You were going to say the same book?
Same thing. But these days, too, you know, I'm pulling out my James Baldwin off the shelves, right, too, because I think that is something that we need to read that as well.
And he could have written it last week. That's the crazy thing.
It's the sad part.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So thank you both. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Joanne and Chris.
Thank you.
I hope this is the beginning of a larger effort to really bring our communities together. I know that if there is a young person out there who can solve these problems, they're part of the Oliver Scholars community. And we have so much more work to do, but I am going to check out that book. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good to see you, friend. I'll see you soon.
Good to see you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.